we have returned. As we were going into that break, we were talking about, or Paul Harvey was telling us about the lazy and the fat people. When you get good, you get fat. Then you get lazy. And then you want somebody else to do the things for you. So let's pick it up there. At first, there appears to be nothing wrong asking government to perform some extra service for you. But if you ask government for extra services, government, in order to perform, it increases function, has to get bigger, right? And as a government gets bigger, in order to support its increasing size, it has to what? Tax the individual more. So the individual gets littler. And to collect the increased tax required, more tax collectors. So the government gets bigger. And in order to pay the additional tax collectors, it has to tax the individual more. So the government gets bigger and the individual gets littler. And the government gets bigger and the individual gets littler until the government is all powerful and the individual is hardly anything at all. The government is all powerful and the people are cattle. Now, some believe that the need is for a vigorous, strong man to rise on the scene, to regulate and regiment the affairs of men. Yet history tells us there have been several such. Once upon a time, there was a nation great and powerful and good. Few were suffering from the aftermath of war, from a depression. And then came upon the scene a leader, an idealist, self-confident, intolerant to criticism. A wise lady limited his early activities to combating the financial depression. Nobody could argue with that. But in a little while, he began to regulate business and establish new rules to govern commerce and finance. Some of them in a diametrical disagreement with the God-made laws of supply and demand. But anybody who disagreed with those new rules was promptly fired. The new leader saw that under the old system of free enterprise, landlords prospered. So he levied new taxes to take away their profits and destroy what he called the monopoly of capital. To please laborers, he controlled prices. To win the favor of the farmers, he gave them loans and subsidies. The national debt mounted alarmingly. Whenever anybody tried to tell him that governments, even as people, can go broke when they spend beyond their incomes, he said, they just don't understand deficit finance. Well, what do you say? Did he build on a rock or on a sand? I say sand. For you see, this was the story of Emperor Su Tongpo, who led China to its doom more than 1,000 years ago. I'm satisfied with all my heart that if Uncle Sam ever does get whipped, here too, it will have been an inside job. It was internal decay. It was not an external attack that destroyed the Roman Empire starting about 146 BC. Internal conditions in Rome were characterized by a welter of class wars and conflicts, street brawls, corrupt governors, lack of personal integrity and moral responsibility. About 290 years after Christ, a Roman emperor named Diocletian took over. He really grabbed the bull by the horns. He took over in a period of turmoil and severe depression. The first thing Diocletian did was call in the gold and close the banks and raise the taxes. He reduced the power of the Senate, delegated its power to a lot of little government bureaus. Do you know they even had a transportation act back there, prescribing the fee required to rent one laden jackass per mile, and at today's rate, its exchange, it would have mounted to about 1/8 cent per mile, which meant that in order to make a profit on the jackass, you would have to carry 5 passengers. That would simply beyond the capacity of the jackass. Diocletian put millions of people on the public payroll, but when this failed to do the job, the country was still in trouble. He asked more personal powers for himself. For a brief while, incidentally, they were standby powers. But then he used them all at once. He froze wages, he froze prices, he froze jobs, he stopped profits. He dictated to the farmer what he should plant and when and how he should sell it and how much, and how much he could ration the food. And what happened? The labor market closed down, incentive was gone, and farm life became dependent on bureaucratic red tape. Exorbitant taxes cost the farmer his land. He kept for himself only a small plot on which he might grow turnips for his family. He lost the rest of it to the state, and without food and without incentive he went gone city life. The city life stagnated and declined. And Rome passed into what history has recorded as the Dark Ages, lasting 1,000 years. Just by turning to the left, the world was gone in circles. A nation would evolve from a monarchy into an oligarchy, from an oligarchy to a dictatorship, from a dictatorship to bureaucracy, to pure democracy, where finally the people would cry out from the chaos and the confusion in the streets, "Oh, please, God, give us a king." And God would give them a king, and they'd have a monarchy again and start the whole silly cycle anew. Now, either we will profit from the errors of their ways, or it follows as the night the day, our children are going to have to relive the Dark Ages all over again. How come, after thousands of years of experiment, our new nation has come so far, so fast? All in less than 200 years. What is the secret to our success here? Well, I think it had to do with a basic American's creed. Perhaps it never passed a pioneer's lips in this form, but if it had, I think he would have said something like this: "I believe in my God, in my country, and in myself." I know that sounds like a trite, too simple thing to say, and yet it's a rare man today who will dare to stand up and say, "I believe in my God, my country, and myself," and in that order. When the early American pioneer first turned his eyes toward the West, there were only Indian trails, or traces as they were called, for him to follow through the wilderness. Do you know today you can roller skate from Miami to Seattle, from San Diego to Plymouth Rock? In this little bitty instant, as historical time is measured, our 7% of the Earth's population has come to possess more than half of all the world's good things. How come? Well, sir, when the earlier pioneers turned his eyes toward the West, he didn't demand that somebody else look after him. He didn't demand a free education. He didn't demand a guaranteed rocking chair at eventide. He didn't demand that somebody else take care of him if he got ill or got old. There was an old-fashioned philosophy in those days that a man was supposed to provide for his own and his own future. He didn't demand a maximum amount of money for a minimum amount of work, nor did he expect pay for no work at all. Come to think of it, he didn't demand anything. That hard-working, hard-handed pioneer just looked out there at the rolling hills stretching away to the tall green mountains, and then lifted his eyes to the blue skies and said, "Thank you, God. Now I can take it from here." That spirit isn't dead in our country. It's dormant. It's been discredited in some circles, driven underground, but it isn't dead. It's just that a few seasons ago, politicians baiting their hooks with free barbecue and a trading Ponzi scheme promise for votes began telling us, "We don't want opportunity anymore. We want security." "We don't want opportunity," they said. "We want security." And they said it so often we came to believe them. We wanted security, and they gave us chains, and we were secure. Suddenly with our constitutional guarantees depleted, with our national character eroded away, with our tax laws penalizing those who would dare to prosper, with workers concentrating on how little they can get by with instead of how much they can produce. Suddenly we looked overhead one day to discover that the first to the moon in space was a Russian accomplishment. Russian. The free men dragging their feet had been outdistanced by slave workers dragging their chains. And we were sore afraid. Perhaps this was a disguised blessing, too. Maybe. a dramatic accomplishment. But this Cold War adversary was necessary to get us off our dead centers and back to work again. If we can revive in ourselves, then in our youth, something of that basic American's creed, the horizon has never ever been so limitless. We're going to stop there because we're heading into a break. Paul Harvey, do you recognize anything from 1965 to today? You're listening to CSC Talk Radio. We will be right back.